Welcome to the Human Origin Project, where we explore the science of you. To keep up to date, go to our iTunes channel and subscribe, and please leave a review if you enjoyed today's show. The precession of the equinoxes is an astronomical motion of the zodiac constellations along the ecliptic plane, or the Earth's orbit. Today, many people are disconnected from the movement of the stars and planets above us. In this episode, Stefan and I unpack a simple definition of the precession of the equinoxes and the ancient knowledge of this great cycle. Why do traditional cultures measure and treasure this 25,890 year period, which today astrophysicists are grappling with what causes it and are still unable to confirm its significance? Its traces are etched into archaeology across the planet. From what is an equinox and solstice, we explore a beginner's guide to precession. Hey Steph, how are you, man?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. It's kind of late at night here. We're recording this episode. We've kind of been nutting it out or not, haven't we? It's a bit of a confusing topic.
Yeah, trying to work out if we should sleep on it and do it in the morning or get it done tonight. But we're going to be talking about the precession of the equinoxes, which is something that I've only been introduced to in the last sort of 2 years or so. And it's a really interesting topic. It's kind of like, it kind of covers the grounds that I'm really interested in of this modern knowledge, modern scientific understanding and mixed with ancient culture, because this spans back thousands and thousands of years to no one really knows when. Yeah, and the thing that got me interested in it was I kept kind of hearing the term precession of the equinoxes, but I didn't actually know what it meant, and I kept reading different references and different ancient texts, and it once I started to look into it, into the modern definition of it, it surprised me how for one, little most people know about it. I certainly didn't know anything about it before I began to look into ancient texts more, and then actually when you kind of dive into what we modern astronomers and scientists understand about it, is there's a lot actually that's quite mysterious about the precession of the equinoxes, and it's endemic across the planet that people used to kind of measure this and try and understand what this movement of the stars was. And so I thought we'd kind of dive in and just have an overarching episode on precession and what it is, why it was measured, but we're going to do a lot of shows on this, so this is kind of going to be the first of a series leading into some very in-depth theories as to why the precession of the equinox happened. So that's going to be really interesting. Yeah, that's been a really fascinating thing with learning about it, is that there is so much that you can go into the history of it, you can read the ancient accounts of it, you can look at modern science where people are still trying to work out exactly what causes it, how long the cycle is itself. So basically the precession of the equinoxes is a motion that is, as we've been talking about, a little bit mysterious as to the mechanism that causes it, but it's basically as the sun rises. Just before the sun rises, there's a constellation that appears in the sky behind where the sun will eventually rise. And it's a very, very slow process, but over a span of thousands and thousands of years, those stars appear to move. So one constellation that rises, that sits behind the rising sun, will be different as the years progress. So in 5,000 years from now, it will be a different constellation to what we can see now. And that's the vernal equinox, isn't it? So the spring equinox is the definition of when you measure when the sun is, what constellation the sun is rising into. And what you kind of described there was basically we're looking at the sun. If you're sitting on a carousel with a friend, you're looking at your friend. The friend will be, your friend will be spinning around, but the background will be moving, and your friend will appear still. And so when you see the sun rising, the sun appears relatively still, but the background star, or the sidereal star background, is moving very, very slowly. And that's the measure of the precession of the equinoxes. On the equinoctial sunrise, you mark what constellation is going into. Yeah, and the fascinating thing about this is that, very different to a carousel, which will be over in a few minutes, depending on where you are. But the stars, to get from one constellation all the way around through the 12 constellations back to that point, takes roughly 26,000 years, which is a pretty long time, especially considering, modern civilization has only been around for 12,000 years, up until the last ice age. So it's hard to imagine how anyone could have came to an understanding of this, because it's such a long process.
Yeah, and the constellations is something that, I've been reading it more and more about astronomy and even astrology too, but, the constellations are more associated with astrology, but, this is, clear astronomical phenomena. And so I just thought I'd list them out just for people that aren't so familiar. So the 12 like hands on the clock, or numbers on the clock, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo, Libra, Scorpius, Sagittarius, Capricornus, Aquarius, and Pisces. And so we're currently the time or the constellation that the sun is rising into is the Pisces, on the verge of Aquarius, and that's where you may hear the age of Aquarius, or we're dawning into the age of Aquarius, made famous by the musical Hair. But so we're right on the borderline between Pisces and Aquarius, and this is this marker point. And that's what we're kind of going to explain now, because it's kind of confusing, isn't it? Because you don't understand, they're not everyday terms that you use, and when you dive into it, you actually realize there's a lot to this that is pretty important that most people don't understand.
Yeah, and it's so interesting thinking that there was such a strong effort to commemorate and note what constellation or what sign, where we were in the precessional cycle, all throughout history. Like cultures there'd be more artwork depicting fish, or more artwork, especially in Egypt, depicting rams or bulls, depending on, if it's the age of Taurus or the age of Aries. And that's something that's hard to imagine for us at the moment, because we're so far removed from that. But it's pretty much, it's just one, we're all familiar with a year, the concept of a year and the concept of a day. And precession is just one cycle further up the scale, which is, it's kind of out of our mind in modern times, because we feel so far removed from it. But it was as important to all cultures before us. It seems like it was, as the concept of a day or a year for us was. It was just the next step up, which we don't really talk about that much anymore.
Yeah, I think that's important to explain, because when you look at the astronomical phenomena, it makes a lot of sense, because equinoxes and solstices actually define the seasons. And so the Earth basically through one rotation around the sun tilts where the northern or southern hemisphere will face towards the sun. And so when your hemisphere is facing towards the sun, that's summer, and the equinox is the point when the days will actually be equal, because the equator is exactly pointing towards the sun. And as the tipping of the Earth goes towards the sun, towards a hemisphere, the days will become longer in that hemisphere. And on the longest day, that will be the summer solstice. So the solstice day is the longest or shortest day. So on the winter solstice, which will be in the opposite hemisphere, that's the shortest day. And then as we pass back and forth from summer solstice to winter solstice, you hit the equinox point, when either you're passing into the longest days, which is the vernal equinox or the spring equinox, or the autumn equinox, which is when you're going from the longer days to the shorter days. And so it's this tilt of the Earth as we rotate around the sun. And so the equinox is that equal, where every day on the planet is equal in time. And when I was growing up, I always hated the autumn equinox, because I knew it was the day that daylight savings would change and the days would get shorter, and it would really, I'd always get down on that, and I'd always be so excited. Just everything's going downhill.
Yeah. But yeah, it is interesting when you picture it like that lots of cultures describe it as the great year, which is, the as we were saying before, one step above our year of 365 days. A step above that is the great year, which is this almost imperceivably slow cycle, which takes 26,000 years. And there was such a strong effort in ancient cultures to mark these dates, so much so that they built some of the most famous structures left to us from the ancient world, things like Stonehenge and Chichen Itza, and temples all over the world that would signify the equinox or the solstices, depending on what was more important to them. But places like, still today, thousands and thousands of people go to Stonehenge to watch the sunrise on the solstice, or the sunset on the solstice. So for the ancients, marking and knowing the point of time that they are within the great year, the precessional cycle, was so important.
And the interesting thing about that is sometimes it's kind of disregarded as ancient people just measuring the seasons for farming purposes, because equinoxes and solstices obviously mark significant times in the year when you farm and plant crops, because you knew exactly when autumn and spring and the summer were coming. But the precession of the equinoxes show that there was a much, much larger cycle at play. So we know the seasons, obviously, and our days are kind of broken up into four segments, but then the year is broken up into seasons. But then the precession of the equinoxes really, as you said, talks of this larger cycle that really we're very disconnected from. We don't really understand the significance of at this stage. But ancient cultures did talk about how we would have this larger seasonal cycle, which is really interesting. But so those references that people see in ancient structures all over the world, at Chichen Itza, for instance, on the equinox day, you see the snake run down. It's just unbelievable. That it boggles my mind every time I see it. But what they were kind of showing then was this understanding of, probably not only the seasons, but this much, much larger cycle of time too, which is really interesting because, today, as we're looking to now, we don't actually understand all that much about it. And so if there was a more detailed understanding of this, it's probably pretty important that we get to the bottom of it.
Yeah, definitely. And a good way that I've learned how to understand it. It's hard to explain, but without the aid of pictures. If you imagine a clock with 12 hours, 12 numbers on it. If you replace those numbers with a constellation of the zodiac, and imagine that every hour is a great month that falls within the great year. So as you go through the great year, it takes, instead of taking 12 hours, it takes 26,000 years. So between each number, instead of 1 to 12, there's each constellation is split with a 30-degree portion of the sky. So it instead of taking 12 numbers on the clock, there's 360 degrees of sky. So each hour turns into 30 degrees of movement. And just for some sort of perspective on how long it takes for just 1 degree of motion. So that's if you stare at the sun just before the sun rises on the vernal equinox, for just 1 degree of movement of that constellation before the sun rises, it would take roughly 72 years, which is about the length of one human lifetime. So it's unbelievably slow. It's almost, I don't think you would notice it in one lifetime.
Yeah, you would notice very little. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's something that has taken such a long time to understand. Even in modern times, like, we're still coming to grips with how long the cycle is, because it seems to be speeding up and slowing down, and there's lots of factors that go into the motions at play. So it's it's really hard to know how long it is.
Yeah, and the way I kind of picture it is that I picture the Earth inside that 12-handed clock, or 12-hour clock, which are the constellations. And when it's, as you're facing from the from the Earth, well, actually between the sun, you'll see one of those backgrounds, and as the sun moves around, we will see the background of that star drop. And so it's this huge clock that spins around 26,000 years. And for 1 degree, it's 72 years. So it's this huge time span. And so what really, it's interesting actually that modern calculations of precession, so we've talked about the ancient calculations, but modern calculations really are showing that it's starting to speed up, aren't they?
Yeah, there's been really interesting work coming out of I think it was Caltech, the astronomers there, who've been studying this for the past few decades, and they've noticed that the rate of precession, so the rate of our apparent motion, is speeding up. I mean, it's still quite slow, but it's definitely noticeably faster than it was even 20 years ago, which we don't really know what causes precession. It could potentially be, us moving through space within our solar system. It could be us, there's lots of things it could be. But
the current theory is it's lunisolar wobble, which is the gravity of the sun and moon tilting the Earth and making us wobble to the background of the constellations. But there is some controversy around that now, whether that's true, which we're going to cover. But there are other explanations too, potentially, as to why this movement happens, and the implications of that are quite interesting. We're going to go into we're going to do a whole episode on the causes of precession, which is a topic that I really kind of went into probably about 1.5 years ago, and it's really, really interesting. And there's a very few amount of people in the world that are kind of focusing on this, and we're going to interview some of the ones that are actually probably on the verge of a breakthrough of really understanding the concept, which is really exciting. Yeah,
definitely. And it's so exciting to be, having this discussion now that there is so many people looking to what causes this. And it's really interesting that there is kind of a wider perspective on things, which it kind of makes sense. How much a day affects us. The rising and setting sun controls our circadian rhythm, our sleep cycle. We know when to eat, we know when to go to sleep. The seasons, and so the cycle of the day is super important. The cycle of the year is as important, going through summer, winter, autumn, spring, and the difference that has on the world and our bodies and animals and migrations and all those sorts of things. It's just a cycle above that, the precessional cycle, which could potentially be as important to human existence. It's just something that we may not fully understand yet. It might be something that we are getting closer to understanding, which is a really interesting thought.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting anomaly that is it 2 full moons equals 1 degree in the precessional movement. What's that measurement?
Yeah, so if you look at the night sky when there's a full moon and picture that full moon as half a degree of the total 360 degrees of sky, which would mean that if you imagine 2 full moons in the sky next to each other, that would be 1 degree of sky. So you have your 2 full moons. That's how much movement the constellations appear to make after 72 years, which is, it's very minute. I don't think, I mean, if the sun rose 2 full moons away from where it did yesterday, I don't think anyone would notice.
It's such a fascinating measurement, and for anyone who wants to read a little bit more about this, there are articles on the website on the precession of the equinoxes and kind of some diagrams, because it is quite confusing to picture. So it is good to kind of jump in and look at diagrams of the sun and earth and everything. But also too the lunar calendar, which is really, really interesting, because we know how influential the lunar calendar is, yet it really hasn't been very acknowledged as to how it affects the seasons, the tides, the human physiology, all kind of things. Australian barrier reef, for instance, blooms on a full moon. These are huge factors that on Earth that are depending on the moon, and we are a little bit lost as to how these processes affect us. And one thing that I've really kind of found in the health sphere is that connecting to, for instance, the diurnal rhythm, the sun, the physiology of vitamin D, of vitamin A, of melatonin, the brain, the pineal gland, the endocrine system is very much connected to how you understand the movement of astronomical bodies that we are, basically connected to. So it's precessional movement is, such a bigger span of time. It really starts me to think, are we connected to these larger cycles? And when you kind of go into, potential, causes of it, it really shows that, maybe there are very big connections to, potentially far away things in the universe. And that's why people, for instance, were looking at, why were the constellations, why were they marked and measured as they do? Because it's a very strange thing, isn't it? And the precessional measurement measures that 16-degree band in the sky where those stars sit. But when you look at the constellations themselves, they don't actually make up the animals we describe them as. So it's this very mysterious origin of where they come from. But it does fit into this cycle of time, which is interesting. And the calendar systems run it. It really goes deep into the human origin story.
Yeah, definitely. And when you look at all the cultures that had stories of this great year and this great cycle, I mean, it's pretty much ubiquitous. You find it in ancient Greece. They're talking about golden ages and silver ages, iron ages, bronze ages. They're speaking as if they know the difference in human existence and the planet as it goes through this larger cycle. So it wasn't just the Greeks that thought that. There was, all through ancient Rome, the Maya had their insanely complex calendar system and ways of measuring huge cycles of time, which they thought human consciousness was tied directly to. And even the ancient Indian philosophy of the Yuga cycle, which is the great year in terms of human experience. So that we go through this vast cycle of time in which there are certain eras where humans are, more spiritual and less spiritual, more material. But they used the vernal equinox to work out exactly where they were in the cycle. It was like looking at the clock, but a clock in the heavens. It was kind of like vitally important to understand where they were up to in this cycle, because that would determine, how the cultures would exist, whether there'd be catastrophes, whether there'd be famines or feasts or whatever it was. So for them and for many ancient cultures, that understanding was so vitally important, because if that was lost, you don't know where you are within the year. It's kind of like, I don't know, for us today, waking up and having all the calendars burnt, we wouldn't know where we were.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective, and one thing that I kind of think about, it's really strange that cultures all over the world had a very, very similar calculation of the great year, and from all those cultures you mentioned, the Yuga cycles and so forth, they were all very similar, and they all mentioned it's close to the precession, the equinoxes, isn't it? The periods they talk about. So it does seem that they were calculating an astronomical phenomena, and it really kind of, and when you look at the modern perspective, when it's now speeding up, and we astronomers today can't definitively define it, because we haven't been around with technology 26,000 years ago to say that, well, this is what happened. There are probably techniques that you can do, but we haven't really reached that point yet. And so there is this misunderstanding that we have about it today, that maybe in ancient texts and so forth there are kind of hints and understandings of. So I mean, and this is I've definitely found that traditional knowledge really does hold a lot of real nuggets of information that we really should be treasuring, right? I mean, overall, if we don't know the rate, and why would it be speeding up? I mean, we're now moving into a vaster knowledge of the universe. The dynamical universe theory shows that we're spinning in a spiral galaxy, and it's so within that galaxy, we know that we're spinning around the center of it, and there is a huge time span in that, and that were these people measuring a larger time span? There's lots of theories of different cycles and different partners of for instance, influences on our solar system. There's a really, really interesting modern dilemma that we're kind of sitting with that very few people are talking about now. It fascinates me. I think about this a lot.
Yeah, I hear it about a lot. But yeah, it's really interesting, and it's funny thinking that a lot of the things that we use today are based on ancient thought, and the ancient calendar systems and the idea of the Yuga cycle and things like that are unanswered questions that you'd think if there was nothing to them, we'd be able to flatly dismiss them. But the fact that so many people are looking at the cause of precession and why it's happening, why it's speeding up, all these unanswered questions. But there are answers if you look back through ancient cultures, which is really fascinating. I love the merging of the two, because I feel like there's a lot to learn if we try and just lose the idea that we're at the pinnacle of human existence, that there may be a potential to remember things that we once knew, or build upon old thoughts that were sort of on the mark that we've fallen off a little bit of.
Yeah, and some of the evidence of that is how old some of the markers of the precession of the equinoxes are around the planet. So one of the old Nabta Playa in the Egyptian desert is a very, very old stone circle that is a measurement of the precessional cycle. And so that's going back 8,000 years. So, somewhere in that range, to a society pre dynastic Egypt. And the origin of the zodiac constellations is something that's kind of attributed around 1000 BC, maybe a little bit before. But there is, if you look at a lot of the calendar systems, a lot of the mythology, there's a lot of symbology that looks a lot like zodiac constellations. So it seems like this is much older knowledge, and even back to Göbekli Tepe, there is definitely potentially some reference to zodiac constellation, and that's really interesting because that's nearly half a precessional cycle ago, 12,000 years ago, and then all of a sudden we've got our oldest record of this huge cycle in time sitting there under the dirt, buried on purpose. Was this a message that people were trying to leave for us, that something that we need to pay attention to and understand, because you do lose it, like we do. You can't go out under the sky today and just understand the precession of the equinoxes. You have to have either a broader technological understanding or an ancestral understanding of people telling you what happens and why. And one interesting thing is that you described it because the zodiac they cycle over the sky over a year, but then that vernal equinox kind of locks into that point, and that's that measurement, that timing point. That there's this whole cycle of stars that you see, but then that point in time is that marking point of this so-called important period that we don't really know what exactly it represents. It's
really it's nice when you go out on a clear night and you can see the stars, and they're all moving throughout the day, but it always comes back to the exact same point on the vernal equinox, so that it's really nice being able to see that motion, and then it sort of locks back into place and then spins and then locks back into place. But that locking isn't set, that's also slowly moving, which is it's really interesting. I'm really looking forward to looking into some of the current models as to why precession happens. There's lots of debate. There was a set idea that was in place a little while ago, and that's kind of been blown a little bit out of the water with new technology and new ideas and things like that. So the conversation is still definitely open as to what's causing it, but there are a few really interesting arguments that we're going to be covering in the next few weeks.
Yeah, so if you want to read a little bit more about precession and solstices and equinoxes, there's a series of articles on the website. And so it is a deep topic, and we're going to be covering more. Especially, I really find interesting the crossover of the astronomical knowledge into what we would call astrology too, because there is a lot of practical applications like the lunar calendar, and it's, like I said, the physiological applications, and even just understanding the sun cycles and its influence on the body. It's very important for people to know those things for health, but all of these things potentially have wider implications too.
Yeah, I used to get scared off that word astrology because I don't know, I sort of don't really understand it, and just the connotations behind it, you kind of want to distance yourself a bit, because sometimes you could seem a bit I don't know what the word is, but it's if you do think of it in terms of the sun affecting us throughout the day, that's astrology. Like, it doesn't need to be this far out there theory. There's actually quite a lot of evidence. Even back to in Greece, the word lunacy arose because if people committed a crime on the full moon, their punishment was deemed less severe, because it was obviously not them committing the crime. It was the fact that the full moon makes people a little bit crazy. I mean, that was believed back then, and I feel like there's quite a few papers out on how animals, I think it's lions time their attacks during the full moon, and there are other animals that work around the full moon. So it's not a wild step to think that humans are also affected in a way. I mean, the tides, if the moon's strong enough to pull the entire ocean, then I feel like it can slightly affect people.
I mean, there is enough published research out there to show that there are physiological effects, and we're talking to an expert on hormones and how the lunar calendar can be used for fertility, for instance, and there are some studies to show, for instance, that fertility rates and infertility rates may be associated with being out of sync with the moon. And that's one area. The Islamic calendar, for instance, is a purely lunar calendar, and we know, for instance, the Chinese calendar, nearly all calendars are lunisolar, where they account for the lunar cycles, and this is all just understanding astronomical measurements, and precession is the same. And like you said, astrology can seem like those articles in the paper where it's kind of like
your daily horoscope.
That's right, yeah. But like, this is a real phenomenon. It's really one for interesting, but the science behind it is just fascinating.
Yeah, and it's interesting that maybe it is a case that we are so out of sync with this larger cycle that we've kind of removed ourselves from being able to be influenced by it. Thinking about our Gregorian calendar today is so far off the mark in terms of measuring anything really solidly astronomical. It's kind of a little bit arbitrary. We covered the Gregorian calendar in an earlier podcast, and it's interesting to see that looking back at these ancient calendars, they were most of the most advanced calendar systems were lunar calendars, which is a concept that we're unaware of today, being a purely solar calendar. But when you talk about these papers and this research coming out showing that the full moon affects not only the tides but potentially people and hormone levels, and there could be a whole part of life that we've sort of fallen off the mark of.
Yeah, well, just to kind of quickly cross into another topic that we've been looking at too, but the whole the physics behind electromagnetic waves, astronomical phenomena, and how it influences us is very much being detected now with heavy scientific equipment. And so, for instance, the influence and the idea of quantum mechanics and that quantum entanglement, that there's potentially now moving back to the idea of an ether and a resonance field that we all kind of work and move within, and this kind of goes between relativity and quantum mechanics, and all of those things are pointing to the idea that an astronomical body can have a bigger influence on the very small, down here. And so the scientific understanding is explaining that these things are, very real, and then it kind of delves then into the world of consciousness. Is all of this, matter and intertwining energies at all just a manifestation of what we would call consciousness, and that we attribute to the brain? But is it coming from, or is it interconnecting with all these larger cycles? Anyway, I think a little bit of philosophy there at the end. I think next week we're going to have a look at sunken cities.
Yeah.
We'll get back on planet Earth.
But really looking forward to getting to that, and to down the track getting back into this and the causes of precession, and going a little bit deeper into exactly what could potentially be happening and what the current theories are. And so there's going to be probably 3 more episodes on this that we'll spread over and release over this series. I'm really looking forward to it. We'll see you guys next time.
Thank you for listening to today's show. For more information, you can read the full transcript, articles, and discussion on our website, humanoriginproject.com. You can visit us on social media at Human Origin Project on Facebook and The Human Origin Project on Instagram. Follow us on Twitter or join the forum boards and email list to keep up to date with all the new information. And if you enjoyed today's show, please subscribe on iTunes and leave a review, because it helps others to find this information and helps us to bring you the topics you want to discuss and hear about. Until next week, I hope your life is filled with happiness, healthiness, and harmony.